With a game as old as Team Fortress 2, there have been countless updates adding new weapons and balance patches. Some weapons that used to be awful are now good and competitively viable, while others have become a sad husk of their former glory. As a current student of game design and a fan of this game ever since 2012, with almost 2,000 hours, I want to propose my own balance changes or discuss changes other content creators have suggested. Because I specifically want to become a gameplay designer, a developer that comes up with the main mechanics / interactions a player will have in the game. And I thought this type of video would help me grow as one, with me suggesting changes and receiving feedback from the community. My reference of balance will consider multiple factors. All weapons do not have random crits or random bullet spread. I also want to try my best to balance between being competitively viable and still fun / useful in casual, as well as keeping weapons as true side grades and not direct upgrades to stock. Besides most classes' melee weapons, of course, like Soldier, Pyro, Scout, Heavy, and Medic, they have objectively better melee weapons than stock, mainly because of the utilities they provide. This series will tackle one class at a time, covering all the weapons of a class that I personally feel that are underperforming when it comes to the role of the class, its utility, or how effective it is in combat. Scout is up first, and let's start with his primaries. I believe that the Shortstop, Babyface's Blaster, and Backscatter are underperforming primaries. Let's start with the Shortstop. The Shortstop, in my eyes, has always been an underperforming primary, and this current iteration is no exception. Also, its current in-game description does not help its case. It says, when the weapon is active, increase in push force taken from damage and air blasts. It holds a 4-shot clip and reloads entire clip at once, and alt fire to reach and shove someone. But there's so much more information that is not communicated. First of all, each pellet that the Shortstop fires does twice the damage of a normal scattergun pellet, but each shot only has 4 pellets instead of the stock scattergun's 10. So that means that each shot does less damage overall compared to stock, from 48 base damage to 72 with max damage ramp up, while stock has a base damage of 60 up to a max of 105. And with it having a reduced pellet count per shot, this means that if you miss just one shot, your damage is reduced by 25%. While if you miss just one pellet with the scattergun, your damage is only reduced by 10. But I'll be fair, raw damage isn't where the Shortstop's strengths lie. Similar to a Force of Nature and Soda Popper, the Shortstop reloads its entire clip as said in the weapon description. It technically has the fastest reload of all scatterguns since it reloads 4 shots at once. And this helps the Scout stay in a fight much longer. It also has a 42% faster firing speed than stock, which of course is one of the pieces of information that the description does not even mention. Now, technically, the Shortstop does have a higher overall DPS due to its increased rate of fire and superior reload speed. But in practice, it is far less effective. For example, to kill a medic with the stock, it only needs 2 good meat shots, while the Shortstop needs at the very minimum 3 shots, either 2 perfect meat shots and 1 last shot for 6 damage, or 3 medium to close range shots. It can't even kill a medic with 3 perfect base damage shots. And as mentioned earlier, if you miss just 1 pellet, your damage drops significantly. With DPS out of the way, let's talk about its last stat change. 20% increase in push force taken from damage and air blast while deployed. With its extremely fast attack speed and reload time, I can understand why this stat is here. It's so the enemy team can push back the Scout that is swarming their teammate with a scattergun that, on paper, has a higher DPS than stock. But as mentioned before, to even reach that DPS, you need to be right next to the enemy. So the extra push force allows the enemy to keep you at a distance much easier, which just makes taking advantage of the higher DPS even harder to do. And finally, the shove. One of the most pointless mechanics on any weapon in this entire game. When you press your alt fire, the scout takes a few milliseconds to pull back and then shove an enemy right in front of him. It has a similar knockback power to the Pyro's air blast. Let's break down why it's completely useless. First of all, the shove pushes enemies away from you. Why the hell would you want to do that as scout? And second, the only time this mechanic is useful is on maps with environmental hazards and you play Ninja Scout, hiding until the enemy walks near a cliff and you push them over it. It's just underwhelming and completely counterintuitive to play Scout. Now, it's time for my recommended changes. First, get rid of the shove entirely. It's not necessary. Instead, I want to take advantage of its unique design. With its 4 barrels and pistol-like grip, I propose a different alternative fire. Similar to the soda popper, after dealing 350 damage, a meter on the shortstop will fill up, and when that meter is full, the player can press their alt fire. All 4 shells will be shot at once with a 20% bullet spread increase. You are then marked for death for 5 seconds and it takes 3 seconds to reload, and you cannot switch to another weapon while reloading. I chose this idea because I still wanted to keep this gun's hit and run design, but I feel like this would be much more fun and viable to use. If all 16 pellets land for a perfect meat shot, this alt fire can deal 288 damage. But of course, it becomes a suicide mission because you will be marked for death afterwards. And in terms of normal performance, I know I complained about the 20% extra push force taken, but with this new alt fire, I think it is far more acceptable to have it on the weapon. The next primary on this list is the Babyface's Blaster, a gun that I think has serious potential to be a proper side grade, but the downsides it has right now are way too severe. When this primary is equipped, Scout starts off 10% slower at 360 hammer units per second. But after dealing up to 100 damage, the Scout's top speed reaches 520 hammer units per second, which makes him 30% faster than a normal Scout at 400 hammer units per second. When Scout reaches top speed with the Babyface, he would be a serious threat, but that's where the absolute crippling downside comes into play. Your boost is reduced whenever you are hit or you double jump. Currently, each point of damage the Scout receives reduces his boost meter by 4%, and double jumping mid-air reduces it by a whopping 75%. So that means if you double jump once, you have to deal 75 more damage to get back to top speed. And if you only take 25 damage, you're back to square one. That means that one shotgun pellet from across the entire map that only does 6 damage reduces your boost meter by 24%. Here are my suggested changes. Instead of 4% boost meter reduction for every point of damage, make it 1 for 1. So the enemy has to deal 100 damage to the Scout as well, which for good demos and soldiers won't be a problem. And reduce the double jump penalty from 75 to only 25% of your boost meter. To counteract this, I am adding 2 new downsides. The first being that when equipped, the Scout only has a 1 times capture rate. The reason being, because Scout can keep his boost meter up much more frequently, and it will be harder for the enemy to slow him down, he could easily slip past everyone and try to backcap. The second is adding a natural drain rate for the boost meter. This means that if a Scout does not damage an enemy player within 5 seconds, the weapon's boost will start to drain. It will be a drain rate of 3% per second. This way, once a good Scout gets the ball rolling with this gun, he has to keep fighting to keep it up, and could push into a surprise enemy attack if he's not careful. The final primary on this list is the Backscatter, a primary obviously designed to make Scout a more flank-oriented fighter. In my opinion, it's not as bad as the previous 2, it just underperforms in the heat of battle. Mainly because once Scout does get a kill from behind, the rest of the enemy team is alerted to his presence, and the upside is completely null and void. Even in a fair 1v1 where Scout and the enemy engage each other from the front, Scout is stuck with two downsides. Because the backscatter is a flank-oriented weapon, I think a simple 20% increase in firing speed would help it a lot. Now the Scout can fire every half second, which helps secure midi-crit kills much easier on heavies and soldiers, and it helps give Scout that very slight edge in a direct face-off. But that's not the only idea I have. This one is a bit more drastic and I feel will absolutely need testing before it's implemented. We keep the increased 20% firing speed, but we also add a 20% increased reload speed, while making the accuracy penalty a bit more drastic, about 25 to 30% less accurate. This way, if Scout does not utilize flanking, he has a better chance at direct face-offs, but has to get much closer, which is a death sentence against soldiers and heavies. Now, onto the Scout's secondaries, starting off with the Bonk Atomic Punch. An odd choice for a weapon, but it does have its uses. If you are a part of a well-coordinated team, the Scout can drink Bonk and become invulnerable for 8 seconds, just as long as an Uber charge. And with this, he can distract a sentry while the rest of his team pushes in. When highly coordinated, it can be useful, but of course feels underperforming in almost any other situation. I couldn't decide on one specific change, so I have two to share with you. The first idea is adding a 50% knockback resistance when under the effects of Bonk, as well as being able to swing your melee, but not being able to use the alternative fire, like the Sandman baseball or Rap Assassin ornament. And self-damage from the Boston Basher would add to the damage you receive and slow you down when Bonk wears off. This allows the Scout to do something more with Bonk. Maybe the knockback resistance is too high, but I still like the overall concept. But now, giving it a second thought after rereading this script, it seems like a lot of Scouts would just cheese it, where they would bait somebody and then just drink it to become completely invulnerable and kill them with a melee, especially slower classes like Heavy. So maybe some other new addition could make this part more viable. The second idea I have is when the effects of Bonk wear off, a shockwave comes out of the Scout, damaging enemies and knocking them back. The damage and knockback depends on how much damage he absorbed, just like the slowdown mechanic. I think the upper limit of damage should be around 50, and the knockback limit should be just a little bit stronger than a Pyro's Air Blast. The upper limit for the current slowdown effect is absorbing 200 damage. I think absorbing 200 damage to deal the max amount of power for the shockwave would work as well. Of course, the shockwave would follow the same rules as explosives, so if somebody is around a corner, they won't receive any damage or knockback. And I think the overall blast radius should be just a little bit bigger than the average size of an open control point, like on Viaduct. That's maybe a bit too big, but of course all these ideas aren't playtested. So now we get to some nerfs to balance this new mechanic. First, I think increasing the cooldown of Bonk from 22 to 40 seconds would decrease the rate that Scout could try and bomb a sentry nest. And increasing the time Scout is slowed down after Bonk from 5 seconds to 8. So it is much harder for him to get out of enemy territory if he decides to go in and bomb the enemy. Now, what you might be thinking is, if this change is made, wouldn't seasoned players not fire at the Scout at all? While this may be true, a good soldier can easily pop a Scout in the air with his rocket launcher to stop his advance, and of course sentries will easily supply the Scout with enough damage to maximize his shockwave. If it turns out that players don't fire at the Scout at all in fear of the shockwave, then probably adding a small increase in push force taken from players, around 50 to 20%, would incentivize players to attack the Scout to knock him back. The next secondary is the Criticola, a drink that will give Scout an amazing upside but has a severe downside that on paper doesn't seem as bad. When you drink Criticola, all damage you deal for the next 8 seconds is mini crit damage. That means you receive a 35% damage boost to your scattergun and melee of choice. And, just like normal crits, mini crits do not suffer from damage fall off, so you can technically kill another light class from across the map with one shot. That is if bullet spread wasn't a mechanic. But it's still a very useful upside. But here's the downside. Anytime you attack while under the effects of the drink, you are marked for death for 5 seconds, and any subsequent attack, while marked, just resets the 5-second timer. For newer players who don't know, if a player is marked for death, all damage they receive while marked is mini crit damage. So the scout is able to deal mini crit damage, but also receive mini crits in return. Which, for the fastest class in the game with the ability to double jump, doesn't seem like that much of a downside. And yes, more seasoned scouts can get more mileage out of this drink, but of course more seasoned players on the enemy team can shut down the scout just as fast. With Scout being marked for death, his effective health is reduced from 125 to 93. The enemy has to deal 32 less damage than normal to kill the scout. So, the moment the scout trips up on their movement, gets air blasted, or receives minimal blast damage that still knocks them around, ruining their momentum, they are guaranteed to die unless a teammate saves them first or an enemy they were fighting was already low on health. Now for my suggested changes. My idea is to make the scout's survivability higher while under the effects of the drink and change up how the downsides work. For starters, when Criticola is active, Scout no longer receives a marked for death penalty. He instead has his movement speed reduced from 133% to 127%. For reference, the Babyface's blaster with no boost starts Scout off at 120%, and a medic moves at 107%. That also means that if a Scout drinks crit with the Babyfaces, he will be at 114% with no boost. I decided to give the drink a movement speed penalty that isn't too harsh, so Scout wouldn't be able to have free extra damage without some sort of drawback, and I didn't want the drawback to be too severe. Next is the rework for being marked for death. Now, whenever Criticola ends, Scout has a base of 4 seconds where he is marked for death, and each time he gets a kill while under the effects of the drink, adds 5 seconds to the timer, and assists while under the effects add 3 seconds. He can be marked for death for up to a max of 20 seconds. So now, the scout can use Criticola as a proper offensive tool, and depending on how well the scout did, affects how long they are debuffed. I also think raising the cooldown from 22 seconds to 32 seconds would also balance it out. The next secondary we'll be talking about is the Winger, a weapon I myself used religiously until the past year. Now, you may be asking, well, if you liked it so much, why is it in this video? Well, the main reason why I liked it was strictly for its extra jump height utility. I switched to the stock pistol recently because I never realized how good its chip damage capabilities were. Anyways, I feel that the Winger itself is in a good spot right now, but compared to the chip damage of the pistol, its upsides fail in comparison. So I suggest adding just one stat to the weapon, minus 20% bullet spread. This allows the 5 rounds it has to be far more effective, but the weapon isn't buffed to an extreme degree or changed in any drastic way, because I love the utility it provides, but due to the drastically reduced clip size, it really isn't good for combat. Sure, it has extra damage per shot, but that is only helpful when you land the shots up close. So the reduced bullet spread helps make the Winger just a little bit more effective. The final secondary on the chopping block is the Flying Guillotine.
Boo, you suck!
A weapon with a neat concept, but when compared to other sources of damage for Scout, it pales in comparison. For example, If a scout is engaged in close quarters combat with an enemy, any scattergun is much more powerful in said range. And if the enemy is running away, your hitscan pistol is much more consistent at dealing damage. Hell, because the guillotine is a projectile, it is easier for enemies farther away to dodge it. Yeah, the guillotine has good burst damage with 50 on impact, and it has the potential to deal 90 overall with its bleeding, but with a scattergun you can achieve 105 damage with each shot up close. And with the pistol's rapid fire and quick reload, the damage racks up so much faster than waiting for another guillotine. The guillotine is an alright weapon, but the other damage dealing options for Scout are so much more consistent and reliable at getting kills. So I propose to make it a utility weapon. First, let's reduce the base damage to 20 and leave the bleeding intact. Now, if a scout lands a hit with the guillotine, the target receives reduced healing from all sources by 35% for 10 seconds. Second, the long distance hit reduces recharge time stat is buffed to reducing 3 seconds instead of 1.5. And the recharge time overall is increased from 6 seconds to 17 seconds. This will give the scout a unique item that, if used properly with a coordinated team, can be used to focus fire a specific target, switching it from being a lackluster damage weapon to being a helpful support weapon. Finally, we will be discussing Scout's melee options, starting off with the Sandman. Now, I completely understand the nerf where they got rid of the stun mechanic. Stun mechanics are not fun to play against in a first-person shooter that also emphasizes using your mechanical and tactical skill to best your opponent. That being said, I feel that the Sandman is now almost entirely useless because the baseball and its effects are way too weak. At first, I was having trouble on what to specifically change about the Sandman, but after reading some specific details about it on its wiki page, an idea came to me almost immediately. I read that the baseball that the Sandman shoots is considered melee damage, and that made me immediately think of the most annoying weapon in this game, the Vaccinator Minigun. A minigun that has damage resistances for fire, bullet, and explosion, but not for melee. So, I decided to give Scout a way to combat the Vaccinator. Now, with my changes, the baseball has a base damage of 20 and ramps up to 50 damage the farther it travels. And if you score a moonshot, the ball receives a mini crit multiplier, so a moonshot ball will deal 67 damage to a Vaccinator medic or their healing target, which will help soften them up for your team. You could also combine this with my version of the Guillotine to help reduce their chances of survival even more, bringing back the old Sandman Guillotine combo to help combat one specific instance, while still having both weapons be useful on their own. All the other stats for the Sandman remain the same mechanics with the slowdown and ball recharge rate, and the same downside of minus 15 health. The next melee is the Candy Cane, a weapon that is extremely situational. First, let me list off the problems I have with the weapon. For example, if the enemy team has no soldiers or demo men, this weapon is a direct upgrade for Scout. But if there is even one soldier or demo man, they completely dominate the Scout, making his counter classes much harder to fight against. So I want to fix both problems at once. So I suggest changing the health pack drop system so every 2 kills that a scout gets, a health pack is dropped. So if there are no explosive classes, Scout still has to earn the health packs. I also want to reduce the explosive vulnerability downside to 15%. That makes it so a scout has to be topped off on health if he wants to have a fighting chance, but if he isn't, then he is punished for engaging in combat. I feel that this makes it more fair for non-explosive classes fighting Scout, and it gives Scout a slightly better chance fighting explosive classes, unlike the complete oppression they have over him with this weapon's current iteration. Up next is a late addition to this video and not fitting of the theme of buffing underperforming weapons, but this weapon is too good not to talk about. The Boston Basher is a staple of competitive Scout, for a good reason. A melee weapon that allows you to hit yourself so your medic can build uber faster, and unlike Soldier and Demo, there is no ammo to waste or reload, so it is the best option for building uber while expecting an engagement with the enemy. So I suggest 15% reduced healing from mediguns and dispensers, and 10% reduced healing from medkits on the wearer. Because let's be real with ourselves, the only time the downside of hitting yourself is actually a downside is when you miss all of your scattergun shots, don't have any pistol ammo left, and you pull this thing out and you go for the kill and miss. The weapon has basically two upsides, with one of them disguised as a downside. So I think reducing the healing would make uber building more dangerous for the Scout and less of a free pass to build uber for the medic. Alright, this is me while I'm editing the audio, and listening back to this, I realized that because it has a slower healing rate, just like the escape plan for the Soldier, that just means that the medic will basically build uber at full speed for longer. So I feel like adding another downside to this, where it's a minus 50% holster speed, so it's more a detriment to the Scout, where if he's just trying to farm uber with his medic and the enemy does a surprise push, then he will get caught out and have to switch to his weapons, but a lot slower. Getting back on track with the next weapon, the Sun on a Stick. An extremely situational weapon that requires extreme coordination from a friendly pyro to be useful at all. And even then, the scattergun completely outshines it in damage. Now, my idea for this weapon is pretty drastic because I'm thinking of giving Scout the ability to deal fire damage, which is something only the pyro can do if I am not mistaken. Huntsman arrows don't count, you need a pyro to light it outside of medieval mode. But think about it for a second. Bleeding is a similar effect to Afterburn, and multiple classes can inflict it. So I think giving another class the ability to deal fire damage isn't too drastic of a change. Hell, it even gives Pyro a more important role of extinguishing teammates and getting more rewards out of it with his different weapons, instead of having to rely on the enemy team having a Pyro as well. Anyways, here's my suggestion. We keep everything the same, but give the Sun on a Stick an alternative fire that shoots out a fan of flames in front of him. When it makes contact with an enemy, it does the base damage of the weapon, 26, and has 6 seconds of afterburn, but the afterburn only does 2 damage per tick, unlike the stock flamethrower's 4 damage per tick. Which roughly means flamethrower afterburn does 8 damage a second, and the new Sun on a Stick alt fire afterburn will only do 4 damage a second. And the alternative fire will have a recharge time of 25 seconds. This gives Scout the ability to use this weapon without having a friendly pyro, and also give a small bit of crowd control since the fan of flames can hit multiple people. Next up is the Fan of War, a staple for Scout's arsenal in man vs. machine. But we aren't talking about MVM, we're talking about casual or competitive PvP. And in a normal PvP scenario, it is absolute garbage. Because why the hell would you want to mark someone for death when you can kill all classes at full health except heavy in 2 clean shots with your scattergun? You're already in melee range, might as well try to kill the guy yourself instead of having to rely on your teammates. This is one of the more unorthodox changes, but I still feel it would be fun to use and fight against. I'm thinking of keeping all the stats and mechanics it has right now, but adding a few things. First of all, whenever you hit an enemy with the standard fire, you also gain 10% speed boost for 2.5 seconds, and you can now have multiple targets marked at once. I also want to give it a faster holster speed, about 25 to 30%. And third, we add an alternative fire. You hold down right click to charge up for 6 seconds, If you let go before it's charged, nothing will happen. But once it's fully charged, you can hold it for the next 6 seconds before it automatically releases. Of course, you can release it before then, and you cannot switch to weapons while holding the charge. Now, onto what the charge does. When you released a fully charged Fan of War onto enemies, you give off a similar knockback effect to Air Blast, and all enemies caught within the blast are marked for death, but only for 5 seconds. And you are also slowed down for 15% for 3 seconds as well. This way, its utility of making teammates deal more damage is much more noteworthy, while also risking yourself by still getting up close and personal with the enemy. The second to last weapon is the Atomizer, a weapon with alright utility but horrible combat power. The upside of mini-critting while airborne is extremely gimmicky and never worth it in a serious fight. So I think adding a new mechanic to the bat would make it much more viable. The mechanic I have in mind is whenever Scout jumps in mid-air with the Atomizer deployed, he gains 1 charge for the Atomizer for each jump. When Scout attacks while the Atomizer has a charge, a projectile similar to the Soldier's Righteous Bison or the Engineer's Thompson shoots out, having the same damage properties as the Atomizer itself. So this means it deals 30 at its base and is affected by mini-crits when Scout is airborne. But the moment the Scout lands on the ground, the Atomizer loses any charges the Scout did not use. The projectiles themselves do penetrate through players, but do not hit a single enemy more than once. They also travel at a similar speed to the Bison's projectiles. This makes the Atomizer a bit more effective in close quarters combat, while giving it a fun mechanic that I feel isn't overwhelming. And finally, the last weapon of the video, the Rap Assassin. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know how to balance this in comparison to the rest of the weapons. As it is right now, it's just a better Sandman in terms of damage. But considering the changes that I made to the Sandman and other melee weapons, as well as the Guillotine, I'm not sure what to change about it. So I think I'll give this one to you guys. Compare your ideas to what should be changed based on my ideas for the balance changes in this video. And if the comment gets a lot of likes or I find one that I particularly enjoy, I'll feature it in the next video of the series. What I'm looking for is a balanced idea that makes the weapon unique in its role while still keeping its main identity. So I'd say I would like to keep the ornament that deals bleed damage, but other than that, change whatever you feel like. I make changes based on what I think would be fun to use and fun and fair to fight against. That's my main goal with this series. In the next video, we will be covering my favorite class, Soldier. As you can obviously tell in the background footage of this video, I am not great at Scout. So of course, more seasoned Scout players might disagree with me on my balance changes. And feel free to say what you would change about my decisions in the comments below. If I see points I like, I'll definitely reply to them. Tangent aside, Soldier is my most played class and I am far more familiar with each of his weapons' strengths and weaknesses. So my suggestions for balance in the next video will be much more educated than today's video. And a few that I've personally thought of for a long while now. Of course, if you want to be notified of when I upload the next video, feel free to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the content and want to see more. Now this last bit will be off any script, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching, and I definitely want to make more TF2 videos, not just balance changes. Probably thinking about new weapon concepts or new class ability concepts or stuff like that. But I also want to do other games as well. But not just talking about game balance, talking about other things like story topics, why some games are fun and some are not, like these two, for example, and any other video game topics that I find interesting and want to have a discussion with the community about. So, until next time, this is Cyclaw, and take care.
Ellie's gonna upgrade it.
I ain't playing.
Nice.
Right? We got no engineer. Oh, never mind. Okay, we do.
Sorry, I just wanted to rocket jump.
I have no idea if that's working. What's working?
No.
Go to
Hey,
answer.
wait, come here.
The conch is great and all, but I like 20 extra health and crit immune. Okay.
Bro, it's not letting me taunt. There we go. Come on.
I don't have a taunt key now.
Do it.
My man!